So, as you said, I am Davey Shafik. What does that mean? So, I am a community engineer at Engine Yard. I am the author of the Zen PHP 5 Certification Study Guide, PHP Anthology, and PHP Master for SitePoint. I am a contributor to Zen Framework 1 and 2, PHP Docs, internals, a little bit, and lots of other projects. And I'm at dshafik on Twitter. Before I start, I wanted to point out that PHP Women is doing a fundraiser for Purple Elephants, phpwomen.org/elephant. Go and grab one, Kickstarter. I want to apologize for my accent. I will switch back and forth between, I don't even know what I'm using now, my British and my American accent. So sorry for that. One more thing before I start. I am hard of hearing. This slide did not transition, right? So if you have a question, please do speak up. All right, so I run my slides a little differently to a lot of other speakers. So typically I have 2 slides per sort of thing. So a title slide like this, and then behind it I will have bullets that I'll skip. So if you see me skipping slides, that's all I'm doing, but when you download them later, they'll be available to you. And really it's because nobody wants subtitles. So we're going to start with the small stuff. So I will start by saying that PHP 5.6 is probably the smallest release that we've seen since 5.3. There is not a huge number of amazing features, but there is still some cool stuff. So I was watching the RFCs go through, going, add more stuff, I need more content for my talk. So we've got enough, I hope. We'll start with the TPower, or the exponent operator. So TPower is the new token that was added for that. So basically this is a double asterisk operator which does raising to the power. So the left side gets raised to the right. So for example, echo 2 * 3 * 2 is 512. So it's right associative. What I've got underneath here, I have a pointer on this thing, there we go. What I've got underneath is how it actually breaks down with the right associative stuff. It could also equal 64 if it was left associative, but it's not. It's been added as right. That's very clear to look at. The operator sits between binary not, which is the tilde down at the bottom, and unary minus, which is the negative on the numbers. That's really all there is to say about that. Constant scalar expressions. This one's a cool one, actually, and it was proposed once and got knocked down, and then proposed again, and this is what got in. Basically, you can now use expressions when defining global constants using the const keyword, C-O-N-S-T, or class constants. You can also use them during defining class properties, static variables, and in function arguments. This is actually really cool. So basically, the expressions that are supported, they're all static. That's the key point to this. There's something that can be worked out earlier on in the process than runtime. So you can use integers, floats, and strings. You can use a bunch of the magic constants, and then here docs, so long as you're not using constants, not using variables, and now doc, which doesn't support variables. And then you can use regular constants and class constants. So looking at what that actually looks like, so these are global constants. So prior to 5.4, maybe it was 5.3, they added the const keyword. So before that, you would use define to create global constants. You can now use the const keyword. And if you do that, you have the ability to use expressions like this. So foo equals 1 + 1. Prior to 5.6, that wasn't possible. It had to be 2. And of course, you know that, it's 2, but in some cases where you're doing, for example, on the bottom, where we're adding multiple constants, if you've got logic around those, then you can actually create constants kind of on the fly. So that's global constants. Class constants are basically the same, except they're within the scope of a class. Class properties, however, this one I think is kind of cool. So used to be that they had to be a straight string or a number, same as constants, and then, or, a static array, something like that. Now you can do expressions, including, for example, concatenation. So this one is actually really cool. You'll notice I used double underscore directory there for the magic constant. That one's a nice one to be able to do. And static variables, I don't know anyone who uses static variables. Does anyone use static variables at all for anything? All right, it's just me then. So static variables now support expressions, and I've missed one. What was the last one? Oh, function arguments. Oh, that's a shame. That's actually my favorite slide. There it is. So now in your arguments, you can actually have expressions to create values. So for example, this last one, C equals bar, question mark, which is ternary. So if bar is positive, then it's 10. If it's negative, it's 100. I would never use a constant for that kind of thing. But it could also be, you know, some other static value as whatever. So this one is really quite powerful. This just got in a couple of, maybe a week ago, maybe two, Debug Info. So this is a magic method that was added to control the output of var dump. So taking something like this, we have a class called file with a resource in it, which is our file pointer to, you know, fopen, something like that. Prior to Debug Info being there, if you dumped it, you'd just get this resource of stream or something like that coming out, which is kind of useless. But actually, there's a whole bunch of metadata that we can retrieve that is useful to someone debugging this object. So by defining this debug info, what we can do is say if the file pointer is true, which means it's got a value, in our case, then return stream get metadata, which is an array, or just return an empty array. So if we actually run that, now instead of getting our var dump with the resource, the first time we do it, before we've opened our file, we get an empty array. We get nothing actually because we've returned an empty array. Or after we've opened it, we get this wonderful set of debug information. So you can now pretty much do anything in that. So if you have, for example, an ORM that does interpolation of variables for prepared queries, you could, when you dump, you could actually output the finalized query as opposed to here's the placeholders and the values. So debug info is kind of cool. Any questions so far?
What's the scope of debug info?
What is the scope of debug info? How do you mean?
I mean, is that a global magic method?
No, it's within each class.
Okay,
Sorry, yeah, so it's like _get, _set. You just define it within the class that's going to be, or the object that would get dumped. So this one is really boring, but also kind of cool. GMP improvements and operator overloading. So GMP is an extension for doing math that is more accurate than standard PHP math. It's like BC math. And so what they've done is it used to be resource-based. And as we just talked about, dumping resources with var dump is kind of crap. So they've switched it all to objects, which is sort of a backwards compatibility issue, but most people are not going to see it as one. One of the big drawbacks of using resources is if you cast that to an integer, it actually returns a valid integer, which is the resource ID, not the number that's actually in your GMP resource. So they've switched it all to objects. That makes it serializable. It means you can cast it, as I said, properly, and it's var dumpable. What they also added, though, is operator overloading, which is an internal-only feature for now. I'm hoping someone will, I know there's people shaking heads, but I hope it comes to user land. And basically it allows objects, internal objects, to define the behavior when operators are used on multiples of that object. So basic math operators, bit shifting, concatenation, and the Boolean math operators are all supported. What that means is if you take something like this, which is from some sort of RSA implementation or something, which looks horrible and is terrible to read, where we're doing like GMP MUL for multiplications, adding whatnot, we can now turn it into what looks like actual math, except for the inverts, because there's no operator for that. This works really well. So if you, for example, use a standard PHP integer and a GMP object, they'll work correctly to do what you need to do. But yeah, I hope it comes to user land. So PHP Debug, or DBG SAPI, this is a toss-up for my favorite feature in 5.6. So basically, it's a new server API, I think server API, SAPI, that sits alongside like CLI or CGI, fast CGI, those kind of things. And it's a standalone GDB-like debugger. So you just run it from the command line, and then you can start debugging code. It's not an extension. So if you've used Xdebug or XenDebugger, it doesn't work in the same way. It's not part of your standard, like it's not, if you're using Apache, for example, it's not in that process space. It is standalone, which is really important to understand. But it is really full-featured. So you can break on files, functions, methods, opline addresses. You can break on expressions or conditions, or you can break on opcodes. It does full disassembly of code, so if you're writing an extension, that's really helpful. Or if you really want to see what's going on, or if you want to come to my talk tomorrow, then that's how you can get that information. And it also supports remote debugging. There is a GUI, but it's really just a sort of a command line deal, written in Java. Yeah, that's basically.
What is the code, please?
What is it called?
Yeah.
PHP, hang on. PHP DBG.
No, I meant the
Oh.
Java thing.
Oh, it's just built, it's distributed with it. I actually didn't look what it's called. I've never used it, I just use the command line.
Right.
I just run the SAPI straight on the command line. There's really no benefit to this except that you can do the remote stuff with it. Import namespace functions and constants. So it's possible to define functions and constants within namespaces, but outside of that namespace, you have to reference them using the full qualified name. You could alias the namespace itself to shorten that, but it was really crap. So what this does is it adds 2 new keyword sequences. So they're not new keywords, they're just combinations of keywords. So use function to import functions and use const to import constants. And then you use commas to separate multiples. So here we have a namespace of foo_bar, define our constant hello world. We're now defining a function called strlen, which would obviously conflict normally if it was in the global namespace, but we're not, so that's great. Now we have an empty namespace, just to separate this out. Use function foo_bar strlen. What that'll do is import that function. Now we can just call strlen. If we need the regular PHP one, we fully qualify it with the backward slash, as I'm doing inside of the string length at the top. Something that's really important, I'm going to fall over the back here, sorry. Something that's really important to understand is you can use function on something that doesn't exist. And what will happen is rather than fall back to looking at the global namespace, it'll just fail with a fatal error. So it won't fail at the point of the use, it'll fail at the time of the call. This is actually the case with classes as well. If you can use a class that doesn't exist, it won't call the autoloader until you actually use it. But yeah, by using use function foo_bar strlen, it's no longer ambiguous, so we can call strlen without any slash behind it, or the full qualified namespace. And then we can also use our constant, hello world, because we've imported that as well. It's great for domain-specific languages. So in this case, use function HTML div, HTML_p, HTML_m, and now we have this really nice short syntax for templating, for example. This is pulled straight from the RFC. So I said that PHP Debug was kind of a toss-up. This is the other, well, this and its partner are the other features that I kind of love from 5.6. So it adds a new syntax. So variadic functions is a way to codify and define functions that accept an undetermined number of arguments. Well, I'll get to that. So it adds a new syntax, $$ variable. So when you're defining your function, the last argument can be this style, and anything else that you pass into that function will end up in an array inside of the function. So before adding this, it was possible to do this. PHP has always supported this for the longest time, which is you can use func num args and func get args to grab all the arguments that are passed into a function, whether they've been defined or not. One thing to understand about that, though, is that it includes the defined arguments also. So if your function has in its signature 2 arguments, you have to remove those from the func getArgs response. This new syntax, however, is an array with just the variable arguments, so just the ones on the end. What's nice about this is it gives you self-documenting code, which should always be a goal. It supports by reference, so func getArgs does not support references at all, but there is a syntax that allows you to do references with this. It allows type hints, so you can say that everything that comes at a certain point has to be of a certain type, and it must be the last argument, which is the last thing you need to keep in mind. So what does this look like? So we've got our function here, fn, which has 1 required parameter, 1 which defaults to null, and then our triple dot params on the end, and then we're just var dumping it. So if we pass in just 1 argument, obviously our second one is going to be null just like it always has been. The third one will be an empty array. That will obviously evaluate to to false. So if you want to check if you've got variadics, it's a simple, if false, then you don't have any arguments. If we pass in 2 arguments, we still end up with our empty array. 3, we start filling out our array, and then from there on. For references, you just put an ampersand before. Now, it's important to understand that every single argument then is a reference. This is another example from the RFC. So I wasn't going to include it because I'm like, this is kind of bulky for a slide and stuff, but it's actually really nice code. So we have our prepare, which takes our query and then any number of params. Once it goes into the function, we for each over it. And again, we're using the ampersand param there, so we're still using references, very important. And then we can bind it. So the way bind param works in PDO, it is create a reference type deal. So using references the whole way through, we make sure that we can modify then whatever variable was passed into prepare at the scope it was passed in, like we see down here, and it will actually update the bound parameter. So when we're calling this, we db prepare, pass in name, email, and age as variables. Those are now references. And then in our for each, we're using the new list syntax that was added in 5.5 to define those from an array. So what happens is we for each iteration, we use the list, we define name, email, and age. Those then, because they're references, are bound to the parameters, and then we can just execute. It's actually quite elegant, but also quite hard to follow, but I liked it. So anyways, references. The last part, as I said, is type hinting. So in this case, we have callable. So everything must be a valid callback. In PHP 5.5 that was added. So callable means it can be a valid string, which is a function name. It can be an array, which is a class name as a string and a method, or a object and a method. It can be a closure, or it can be a class with a double underscore invoke magic method. I guess technically it could also have an invoke static as well. But basically what that means is we know everything coming into this function other than the name is a callable, so we can use it as a callback immediately in our for each. That means we don't have to validate every single argument, which is fantastic. So those are cool, but we also have argument unpack, also known as splat. The syntax for this is the same, but we use it in a different place. So argument unpacking is the ability to pass an array in to a function and have those, or an array-like data structure, and have them unpacked to separate arguments. So if you've ever used user func array, this kind of does the same thing, but it's not as slow because call user func array is slow. So it's kind of the opposite of variadic functions. So it unpacks an array, as I said, or similar. So it's not iterators. Yeah, I guess iterators are supported as well as other object type deals. So yeah, no more call user func array, which, as I said, is slow. It's valid for any argument list. So if you're doing new object or anything like that, and you have, say, an array of configuration variables, you don't need to now define those separately in the call. You just use this triple dot syntax. This is not defined in the function level. This is when you call the function. There's no limitations on placement. By that I mean you can use multiples, or you can put it at the end or the beginning, it doesn't matter. Basically it'll unpack, and then everything that follows will just follow as an argument. So if we look at some examples here, function test, we've got a variadic in there, so our arguments that come in, and then we're calling it with either 1, 2, 3, which is standard, that'll var dump as an array in our args, or we can do our new splat operator, pass in an array or an array-like object. So splat is kind of cool. As I mentioned, you can use it multiple times. So we've got 2 splat operators. Like I said, it will just enumerate the first one and then enumerate the second one as extra arguments. Or you can combine and do whatever you want. So they're really, the only thing that you could run into trouble with is obviously if you have a set number of arguments into a function and you have more than that in your array and you don't realize it because you've modified it somewhere else. And then you have an argument that you meant to pass in at the end. So be a little careful with the second syntax. The last syntax. All right, before I go any further, does anyone have any questions about those 5, 6 features? All right. So what next? So that is everything that's new in 5.6 to date. 5.6 is currently on Alpha 2. Hopefully we'll be seeing a release in the next while when it's ready. But 5.6 isn't quite ready yet, but it will be soon. So what next? If that's everything in 5.6, what else is out there? So I wanted to mention HHVM. I think that as developers, as we're evaluating 5.6 or 5.5, whatever you are evaluating for your next version, I think you should be evaluating HHVM as well as a potential for where you want to move next. So if you don't know HHVM, it's an alternative PHP runtime from the folks at Facebook. It's super fast. It's close to feature parity, so you can pretty much just run PHP code now in it. Straight up, you usually don't hit any issues. There are a few edge cases, but their motto is bug for bug. So if there's a bug in PHP, they'll also reproduce that bug in HHVM intentionally so that your code will work the same way. Mostly it's just missing some key extensions. So the INTL extension, for example, is one that they were missing that they're working on. These guys they're working at an incredible pace to add extensions. And as I said, it's just super crazy fast. Along with HHVM, there's a thing called hack, which I possibly shouldn't talk about. It's basically the worst kept NDA secret in the world. I was introduced to it last year, and they've just now started talking about it publicly. So what I'm saying here is subject to hearsay, we'll say. So it may not be 100% accurate, but I'm hoping everything here is accurate. There just may be some stuff missing. It is the most ungoogleable name ever, so I'm hoping that they rename it. It's basically a new, they call it a fork of PHP, so it's not really a new language, because it does sort of look like PHP, and it works the same way. And I know I'm doing like subtitles here, but I didn't want to put a whole slide in. So it is mostly a dev tool. So basically they've got a really cool set of tools that can integrate into their own IDE that they're building, or into your own IDE, say PHP Storm, which is what I use. And it will tell you on the fly if you're doing something stupid like passing in a variable that's an integer into a function that requires a string. So it predominantly runs as a dev tool. And it's ignored during runtime. So by the time that the code actually executes, all of this information is actually thrown out. It runs just as the normal PHP does on HHVM. It uses the $HH open tag. And what I love about this is they've had stickers for, I don't know, 2 years that are the open bracket $HHVM. And I'm like, that's your opening tag, and nobody knows about hack. That's amazing. So there's 2 variants to that. There's the standard $HH, which is the non-strict mode. What that means is that it can coexist with standard PHP scripts. It can include them and just kind of work. So you can sort of incrementally rewrite in hack. And then they have this //strict afterwards, which is kind of like use strict in JavaScript and other languages. I think Perl has it as well, which means that you have to, 1, you have to only use hack, and 2, everything has to be type hinted. I think most people are going to go with the straight HH. It supports a native XHTML syntax, so they don't have to be strings. I'll show you that because it's kind of hard to describe. And it also supports easy parallelization with asynchronous functions, which is really cool. So the guy who was on before me talked about how they're using Node.js, and they haven't looked at HHVM yet. This async stuff is really cool for that. So looking at Hack, as I said, it's not really a fork, but it kind of is. Like, it's not a new language, but it kind of is. So our simple function up here, we just have a string type hint, which is not available in PHP because they won't do it for some reason. But then we have this array syntax. Now, this one here is interesting because there is a proposal for something similar in PHP, and the HHVM guys are like, we have a syntax, please use it. So you may see this one coming to 5.7, I would guess, or maybe 6, I don't know, 7, whatever that number's going to be. So basically, we have this array and then an int, and what that means is it has to be an array of integers, right? So we're being a little more specific about our data types. There's a syntax here, this double equals arrow thing. I have no idea what it is. Nobody can explain it to me. And like, I've looked at it and I'm like, well, I think it's sort of a for each shortcut, but I'm not sure. So no idea what that is. It also supports what are called vectors, sets, and maps. These are specialized array types that do very special things. They have full object-oriented interfaces, which is lovely. And then they have frozen and mutable variants. So if you look down here, we create a vector using curly braces to define our variables, our values, and then we're actually using it as an object with add, reverse, and map, and all this fun stuff here. So this is cool. It has array access type things, so you can use it as a straight array as well, as this object-oriented type deal. But yeah. And then I mentioned the native XHTML type stuff. So if you look down at the very bottom here, we've got this echo div, and you'll notice it's not quoted at all. Basically, tags become sort of first-level language constructs almost, and it has to be valid. So if you screw up your, and this is why I said it's XHTML, if you screw up your XML, it actually will cause an error, a parse error. So it's kind of validating and making sure that your HTML is valid at the language level. Another cool thing that I've seen, React PHP. So React is an event-based async. Hang on before I get into this. Any questions on HHVM? So React is an event-based asynchronous toolkit, I'll call it. It's actually written in PHP, but it's based on a couple of extensions to do the eventing. So it uses libev, libevent, or the stream socket select as kind of a final fallback. So even if you can't install the PECL extensions, you can get a lot of the benefit of the asynchrousness of React. So Phil Sturgeon did a blog post about 3 months ago. Someone else, I don't know who, did a blog post about how Node is so much faster than PHP. And his example was they were doing asynchronous file accesses versus synchronous file accesses, which is PHP. And of course, asynchronous is faster than synchronous when you're doing things like blocking operations, like file I/O. So he went back and he redid the PHP version in React. And it actually benchmarked faster than Node.js. Now, I don't hold a lot of stock in benchmarks, but it's something to keep in mind. If you don't know Node.js or you don't want to get a JavaScript stack happening, React is actually a really good way to do event-based asynchronous applications. So looking at some code, basically, we're going to do a very short HTTP server. So we have this anonymous function that we're going to create. This is basically our entire application. It takes our request and a response. The response should actually be reference. And then basically it writes out a 200 and a content type of text plain and outputs hello world. So any request to this web server is just going to give a 200 status that is text plain and hello world. We create our event loop, which is the main loop within a React application. We create our socket server, and then we create an HTTP server which takes both the event loop and the socket. And then basically we turn it on. So we say on request, do this. So this is our event that we're registering. So on request, call our closure. That could obviously be any type of valid callback. And then we echo out that the server's running, and then we listen. So this listens on port 8080. Any HTTP request to 8080 will end up calling our callback and response in hello world. It has an asynchronous Redis client, 0MQ and stump support, promises. So if you are familiar with JavaScript promises, it's the same interface. It does partials and then GIF socket, which is kind of an amazing cool thing where you have real-time communications through animated GIFs. So, as I said, 5.6 is not the biggest release. So that's actually everything that I have. So any feedback or questions, I'd love to hear them. Yes. Oh, hang on, he's got a mic.
Sorry, it's about the HVM hack. You said it's very ungoogleable, so have you got the website for it?
So, so he said HHVM hack is ungoogleable. So hack itself is ungoogleable, but HHVM is not. And the address should be hhvm.org, I think. I can actually pull it up. I think I have it in my browser. Sorry to the AV guys. So HHVM itself is super easy to Google, which is just hhvm.com. But hack itself is not officially released. So it's included in HHVM, but they have not got any documentation. They're kind of officially denying it, unofficially not. They're basically waiting for some manager to say, okay, we're done. So hack is not something that you can go away and use today, but it's certainly something to think about for 6 months maybe. And as I said, if you're evaluating PHP runtimes, specifically 5.5, 5.6, HHVM is definitely something to look at. Any other questions?
Are there any performance increases between 5.5 and 5.6?
So 5.4 was fantastically faster
than 5. Don't forget to repeat the question.
Oh, thank you. So he asked us, are any performance increases in 5.6? Short answer, no, not really. But there's no performance decreases either. What versions of, who's using 5.3 still? Who's using 5.4? 5.5, anyone? That's actually more on 5.5, that's good. So 5.4 was way faster than 5.3. So if you're still using 5.3, upgrade, for the love of God, upgrade. 5.5 was as fast again, I felt, than 5.4 was over 5.3. 5.5 is fantastic. 5.6 does not continue that trend, but it does not slow down either, which is a win when you're adding features. Any other questions? All right. Oh.
How far away are we from version 6?
Okay, how far are we from version 6? So I am not an internals developer, but I do follow the mailing list. I personally feel that version 6 will never happen. Not that we won't move on from the 5 series, but we have a problem where a bunch of authors went and created PHP 6 books that obviously have nothing to do with whatever PHP 6 would actually turn out to be. So unless we can somehow purge those from the market, I kind of feel like PHP 6 as a version number is tainted. I've asked the HHVM guys, I'm like, can you release HHVM 6 and then PHP can have 7? Like some weird way they would do that. But I think honestly we'll probably do 7. I say we, they, will do 7. So timeline on that, I don't think anyone has come up with any feature that is backwards incompatible that is compelling enough to go on to a new major version. So I think HHVM possibly with hack is really the successor in terms of moving away from where we are right now. There's a question over there.
Oh. How far away are we from PHP 7?
When it's done. Wow. Any more? Honestly, I can't even tell you how far we are away from 5.6. So, to be fair, where we are from 5.7. Wow. All right. Are you asking a question or stretching? Oh, over there in the back. Run. Usually I get out and listen to people, so I'm glad I've got runners today.
Well, just wondering that HVM thing. I mean, do you have a benchmark? How much is going to be quicker than the normal PHP 5.6?
So HHVM bench, and I could give you numbers, but I always feel like benchmarks are very synthetic and kind of retarded. So there are benchmarks on like specific math functions that are like 100 times faster, but they don't matter. Realistically, you are going to see at least as much of a performance increase as like when you turn on APC for standard PHP. I have been told by the HHVM team, they're actually implementing most of their extensions, unless they're wrapping like a C library, in PHP. And then they run it through HHVM to give them the machine code, and then they build that into the HHVM binary, because it's actually faster. The code that HHVM puts out is faster than them writing C++ code. So I think that's kind of compelling. But yeah, it's stupid, crazy fast. It really depends on what you're doing now.
And also this HTML5, like native support in HHVM thing, I mean, is that not against the design pattern for decoupling?
Is the native XHTML support against coupling? I would say not if you're using it in your templates. So, I mean, if you have like views like you have in Zen Framework type deal, which are PHP code, then that's fine. But yeah, obviously separation of concerns is important. I just mentioned it because it's a feature. I don't know if it's a good one. It's a good point. Anyone else?
With HHVM, can you just throw any PHP framework on it? Will it
Okay.
compatibility issues?
With HHVM, is there any framework on it? So one of the things that the HHVM team has been doing for the last 3 or 4 months is they've actually set up a tool to run framework test suites against HHVM with the goal of getting 100% compatibility. At least 3 frameworks, but I couldn't tell you which are compatible at this point.
Slim, Silex, and I believe Symfony 2.
Did you say Zen, Silex, and Symfony?
Slim,
Oh, Slim, Silex, and Symfony 2.
I think. Yeah.
That would make sense, because Silex is based on Symfony 2.
And Zen Framework 1 is 90-something%.
Okay, so ZF1 is 90-something% compatible. ZF2, the issue they ran into at first was the INTL extension, which I fixed the test for that, but they haven't got it.
It runs, if you don't use the I18N bits of Zen Framework 2, then you can use Zen Framework 2.
So yeah, they are really aware of compatibility. Their goal is feature parity, and then obviously beyond that, their own feature set. They're also working really hard to try and bring as much of it back to vanilla PHP as possible. They kind of consider themselves a test bed for new syntaxes. So for example, generators that were added in 5.5 and coroutines, they've had that in HHVM since day one. Of this current iteration of HHVM. The syntax was slightly different. They had to go back and change it to match vanilla, but it was a feature that they first brought up and that they did originally propose, but was knocked down. Anything else?
Okay, so say you've got a simple web service in...
Can you speak up, sorry?
Sorry, say you've got a simple web service.
Yes.
And you want to put that into React. Are there any major pitfalls you should be aware of? How easy is it to do that? Because to me, it's a no-brainer.
It is. Okay, so is there any pitfalls to moving a simple web service to React? Yes and no. Asynchronous programming is a very different mindset. So if you know what you're doing, then that's fine. But there is certainly a learning curve moving to asynchronous stuff. I think React would be great behind something like an AngularJS app that's very client heavy, that just needs to kind of send responses back and from the server as quickly as possible. React is really, at this point it's like 0.4. It's not necessarily stable, but Igor Wiedler, however you say his name, he wrote it, and I kind of trust his code. It is written in straight PHP, so if you have a bug, you can fix it. It's not a C extension that you can't. So yeah, it's definitely something worth exploring, and again, it's more about kind of where you're headed next, like HHVM or 5.6, than saying React is amazing. Anything else?
Regarding HHVM again, should we be concerned that the future of PHP potentially lies with an evil corporation like Facebook?
So, should we be concerned that Facebook owns HHVM? I would say no, because it's open source. That's really my thinking. Facebook doesn't have a do no evil credo, but we know how well that works for Google. So, yeah, I don't have any concerns about it. Then again, I know people personally there, so that is obviously going to change at some point. No, I don't think it's an issue. I think being open source, and they're being very upfront, and they've this last year, they've really kind of pushed on the open source aspects of it, not only to get contributors, but also to make sure that it is out there. They also are, they're not trying to take over PHP. They're not trying to replace PHP. They want to provide an alternative. They don't necessarily want to be PHP. And they're very clear about that as well. So I don't have a problem with it, but that's a kind of a philosophical question you'll have to ask yourself. Anybody else? Starting to think I should have done an HHVM talk. That's all right then. It's a fun subject.
Yeah, garbage collection in Java can be a bit of a black art sometimes. How does garbage collection work with HHVM? Does it suffer from stop the world pauses in the same way as the JVM does?
I don't know 100%. Okay, does the garbage collection HHVM suffer from the same problems as the JVM does? I honestly don't know the exact answer. It should work very similarly to how PHP does, which is ref counting. But I actually know that's not quite the case. They are doing something magical there, but I don't know the answer. Anything else? Okay, so I am giving an internals talk tomorrow. So come along to that. I'm in one of the side rooms. So I'll hopefully see you all there, and thank you very much.
Hello. Just to let you know that lunch will be served in 15 minutes down in the main hall, and we start again at 2 o'clock. See you then.